Okay, friends, in the first lesson on fractions, we learned that a fraction represents an amount that is part of a whole. And in the second lesson, we talked about that denominator, that number that's on the bottom, and we found out what information that denominator will give us every single time. It will tell us how many parts the whole has been divided into. Well, there's one more thing we need to consider before we really dive into working with fractions, and that is we have to think about what's the whole. If we're talking about an amount that's part of a whole, it's pretty obvious that we're going to need to know what the whole is in order to really have all the information we want to have to solve the problem. Go back to the original example I gave you about recess. And I said, I might give my students I said, you can have 100 minutes of extra recess or 3 minutes of extra recess. Which would you choose? And obviously they would choose 100 because it's a larger amount. But if I said, would you rather have 100 extra minutes or 3 extra hours? You'd have to take another step, right? You'd want to consider what the whole is. 100 what? 3 what? And you'd probably have to do some converting, right? To find out which was more if you were trying to go for the larger amount. And you might have to convert 3 hours. How many minutes would that be? Well, 1 hour, 60 minutes, 2 hours, 120 minutes. So what would 3 hours be? 180 minutes. Ooh, that's a long extra recess. So that is the same amount. You've converted it so that the wholes or the units match. Now we can make a much easier comparison. But in order to have the full story, we needed to know what the whole was, right? Well, how do we find out what the whole is when we're working with fractions? Well, if it's a story problem or a word problem, you're going to have context that will give us an idea of what the whole thing is. If I said, Mrs. Wessel drank 3/4 of the water bottle, you would have in your mind, okay, what's the whole? It's 3/4 of a water bottle. So you'd think, okay, there's a water bottle, visualize that. 3/4 would be 3 of the 4 parts that particular water bottle in that particular situation had been divided into for some reason. But it was important that you knew it was of a water bottle. That makes a big difference. So always be on the lookout. You're on the lookout for what the denominator is telling you, and then you're also always going to be on the lookout for what's the whole. I want to have as much information about the whole as I possibly can. So in a word problem, if you read carefully, you'll always be able to find out what the whole is that they're trying to describe a part of. But what if you just have fractions? What if it's just 2/5? And it's not in a story problem, maybe it's just adding, maybe you're adding 2/5 and another 2/5 together, or for some reason you don't have a story that goes along with it. Well, I still can know a hugely important thing about the whole. I know, and I'm just going to erase this for now, I know that this 2/5 comes from a whole that was divided into 5 parts. And that's really important. I don't know if this is 2/5 of a day, 2/5 of a cake, 2/5 of a song. I don't know, but I do know that whatever it is has been divided into 5 parts. And I can model that with one of my little models, right? And I can model 2/5. And again, I don't know what it is, so that's why I'm just using a model so I can visualize how much that is of the whole. But this again told me how many parts the whole was divided into. So that's hugely important. So when you're working with fractions, you're going to be thinking, okay, this is just describing a part of something. Then you're going to think, okay, well, how many parts has the whole been divided into? Look at your denominator. And then you're going to find out how many of those parts this particular amount is describing. And if we keep those 3 things in mind, you will be incredibly successful. So let's keep all that in mind as we move forward working with fractions.